November 15, 1943. The dense jungle of Bougainville Island trembled with the sounds of distant artillery as units of the 3rd Marine Division dug into defensive positions along the Torokina beachhead. Among them, the men of the Montford Point Marines, the first African-American Marines in United States history, stacked ammunition crates and reinforced foxholes, their hands calloused from weeks of labor under the Pacific sun. The air hung thick with humidity that made every breath feel like drinking warm soup, and the volcanic soil beneath their boots released acrid sulfur smells with each step. Japanese intelligence officers, observing from hidden positions in the highlands, prepared loudspeakers and carefully crafted propaganda scripts, confident that their psychological warfare tactics would shatter American morale just as effectively as their artillery shells. They had spent weeks researching American racial dynamics, studying newspaper accounts of discrimination, analyzing reports from their diplomats who had lived in America before the conflict began. Their confidence was absolute. They believed they had discovered a fatal weakness in the American military machine. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. What these officers could never have anticipated was how completely their assumptions would backfire, revealing not just the failure of their propaganda, but the unexpected strength forged in men who had already overcome obstacles far greater than anything the enemy could devise. The path to this moment had begun 18 months earlier in a segregated training facility that would change the course of Marine Corps history. Camp Montford Point, situated near Jacksonville, North Carolina, existed as a separate training ground because the Marine Corps had resisted integration longer than any other branch of the American military. The facility sat isolated on the edge of Camp Lejeune, deliberately positioned far from the main base where white Marines trained. The barracks were older, the equipment more worn, the facilities deliberately inferior, a physical manifestation of the institutional resistance to change. When President Franklin Roosevelt signed Executive Order 8802 in June 1942, forcing the military to accept African-American recruits, the Marine Corps Commandant had declared that his service would accept black men only under protest. Internal memorandums from that period, later uncovered by historians, revealed the depth of resistance. Senior officers had argued strenuously that African Americans lacked the intelligence, discipline, and courage required for Marine service. Some had suggested that accepting black recruits would destroy unit cohesion and undermine combat effectiveness. The Commandant himself had testified before Congress that integration would be the end of the Marine Corps as an elite fighting force. Sergeant Major Edgar Huff remembered his first day at Montford Point with crystalline clarity. He had arrived on a sweltering August morning in 1942, one of 600 men in the first training class. The heat had been oppressive, temperatures hovering near 105 degrees, with humidity so thick you could almost see it hanging in the air like an invisible curtain. The bus that had transported them from the train station in Jacksonville had been a converted school bus with windows that barely opened, and by the time they had arrived, every man's uniform had been soaked through with sweat. The white drill instructors, many of them reassigned as punishment duty for various infractions or because they had angered superior officers, had made their attitudes immediately clear. Some had barely concealed sneers on their faces as they watched the recruits disembark. Others had expressed their disdain through studied indifference, refusing to make eye contact or acknowledge the men except to bark orders. Edgar recalled how the company commander had gathered the recruits in a sandy clearing surrounded by scrub pine trees and delivered a speech that still echoed in his memory years later. The man had stood ramrod straight in his perfectly pressed uniform, his campaign cover shading his eyes so that his expression remained unreadable, his posture radiating contempt and certainty in equal measure. The commander had stood before them, ramrod straight, and announced that the Marine Corps had never wanted them, would never truly accept them, and that most of them would fail. He had predicted that fewer than half would complete basic training, citing vague statistics about washout rates from experimental programs the Army had conducted. He had told them they would serve in labor battalions, loading supplies and digging latrines, because Marines fought, and fighting required men of quality, the implication being that men of their race lacked that quality. He had informed them that they would be held to standards higher than white recruits because they represented a burden on the Corps and would need to prove they were worth the trouble of training. He had made it clear that any infraction, any failure, any sign of weakness would be grounds for immediate dismissal. His voice had carried across the sandy clearing with perfect military cadence, each word crisp and clear, each sentence a hammer blow designed to crush hope before it could take root. When he had finished, he had gazed at them for a long moment, his expression suggesting he expected them to break ranks, to quit, to prove him right before training even began. The silence that followed had been complete. Even the birds seemed to have stopped singing in the pine trees overhead. What the commander had not anticipated was how his words would forge something unbreakable in those 600 men. Private Gilbert Hash Johnson, a coal miner's son from West Virginia, had listened to that speech and made a decision that would define his service. Gilbert had grown up in the coal camps of McDowell County, where his father had worked underground for 23 years until black lung had destroyed his ability to breathe without pain. Gilbert had worked in those same mines from age 14 to 18, descending into darkness every morning before dawn and emerging long after sunset. He had learned in those tunnels what it meant to rely absolutely on the men beside you, regardless of anything else. He had learned that competence and courage were measured by actions, not assumptions. He had learned that survival required excellence because there was no safety net, no second chances when rock collapsed or gas exploded. When the commander had told them they were inferior, Gilbert had recognized the tactic. It was the same thing mine foremen had said about coal workers, that they were disposable, replaceable, not worth the cost of proper safety equipment. And Gilbert knew, just as he had known in the mines, that the only response to that contempt was to perform so flawlessly that failure became impossible to attribute to anything other than deliberate sabotage. If the Marine Corps expected them to fail, they would prove them wrong with a precision that left no room for doubt. If they were given the hardest assignments, they would execute them flawlessly. If they were relegated to support roles, they would become so indispensable that the entire conflict effort would depend on them. The training that followed made previous Marine boot camps look gentle by comparison. The white drill instructors, determined to break these men or at least to prove their own assumptions correct, devised exercises specifically designed to induce failure. 20-mile forced marches in full gear became 30-mile marathons conducted in temperatures that exceeded 100 degrees, with canteens deliberately rationed to create dehydration stress. The routes were chosen for maximum difficulty, through swamps where mud sucked at boots with every step, through thick underbrush that tore at uniforms and skin, through sand so deep that each step forward seemed to slide back halfway. Obstacle courses were run 3 times instead of once, and the times required for passing were shortened to make success nearly impossible. Men had to climb rope walls 30 feet high, crawl under barbed wire through mud, while drill instructors fired live ammunition overhead, vault over wooden barriers taller than their heads, and complete it all in times that would have challenged Olympic athletes. Rifle qualifications required scores that exceeded standard Marine requirements by significant margins. Where standard qualification required hitting targets at 300 yards, Montford Point recruits had to hit targets at 500 yards. Where standard training required field stripping a rifle in 2 minutes, they had to do it in 90 seconds blindfolded. Physical training sessions stretched from dawn until well past sunset. Men ran miles before breakfast, conducted calisthenics until muscles screamed in protest, performed close-order drill until they moved as one organism, and still found themselves ordered to repeat everything because some minor imperfection had been detected. Private Johnson remembered the crucible moment that transformed their entire company with absolute clarity. It had occurred during the 3rd week of training, when exhaustion had begun eroding even the strongest wills, when men were sleeping 4 hours a night and working 20 hours a day, when bodies had been pushed beyond what seemed like biological limits. The drill instructor had assembled them at 0400 hours for what he called a motivational exercise, rousing them from their bunks with shouted insults and the clanging of a metal baton against the iron bed frames. The morning had been pitch black, with no moon and heavy clouds obscuring even the stars, so dark that men could barely see the person beside them. The temperature had already been 85 degrees with humidity near 100%, making the air feel solid and oppressive. He had announced that since they were half the Marines that white recruits were, they would need to do twice the work. He ordered them to complete a full day's training schedule before breakfast. A 5-mile run, 2 hours of close-order drill, an obstacle course run, rifle disassembly and cleaning, and a written examination on Marine Corps history. The entire evolution would normally take 8 hours spread throughout a day. He expected it completed in 2.5 hours, in darkness, before the sun had even risen. His voice had dripped with mockery as he told them he would be timing them, and that any man who failed to complete every element would be immediately recommended for dismissal from the program. He had made it clear he expected mass failure, that this exercise was designed to break them en masse and prove what he had believed from the beginning, that they simply did not have what it took to be Marines. The men had exchanged glances in the pre-dawn darkness, and something unspoken had passed between them, a recognition that this moment would define everything that followed, that failure here would vindicate every prejudice, that success would be the first crack in the wall of assumptions that surrounded them. Without a word being spoken aloud, without any formal agreement or discussion, every man had understood that quitting was simply not an option, regardless of the cost to body or spirit. They had completed every exercise, every drill, every requirement, with a focus that bordered on the supernatural. They had run the 5 miles in formation, maintaining perfect alignment even in the darkness, calling cadence to keep rhythm, helping men who stumbled but never stopping the forward momentum. They had performed close-order drill with precision that would have been impressive in daylight and was extraordinary in darkness, every turn executed simultaneously, every step falling in unison, every rifle movement synchronized as though controlled by a single mind. They had attacked the obstacle course with ferocious determination, completing it not just adequately, but with times that would have been respectable for fresh men in daylight. They had disassembled and cleaned rifles by feel, their hands moving with the automatic precision of weeks of practice, and had passed written examinations, despite fatigue that made reading feel like trying to decipher a foreign language. When the sun rose at 06:30, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they had stood in perfect formation, every man accounted for, every task completed, exhausted but absolutely unbroken. Their uniforms were soaked with sweat, their hands trembled slightly from fatigue, their eyes burned from lack of sleep, but they stood straight and tall and undefeated. The drill instructor had stared at them for a long moment, then dismissed them to chow without another word. From that morning forward, the dynamics at Montford Point had shifted imperceptibly but fundamentally. The drill instructors had continued their harsh regimen, but the impossible had become merely difficult, and the difficult had become routine. By the time the first class graduated in November 1942, 92% had completed training, a rate higher than the standard Marine Corps average. By mid-1943, over 3,000 African-American Marines had graduated from Montford Point. The Marine Corps, true to its initial assessment, had assigned most of them to ammunition and depot companies, support units that handled logistics rather than combat operations. The 51st, 52nd and 53rd Defense Battalions had deployed to the Pacific Theater, where they operated anti-aircraft batteries and unloaded supply ships at bases far from the fighting. The journey across the Pacific had taken weeks aboard overcrowded transport ships where men had been packed into holds with barely enough room to lie down. The ships had been slow, plodding vessels that seemed to take forever to cross each mile of ocean. Seasickness had been rampant during the first days, with men who had never seen the ocean before, struggling to adjust to the constant rolling motion. The food had been barely edible, powdered eggs that tasted like cardboard, meat of indeterminate origin that had been preserved so heavily it bore little resemblance to anything that had once been alive, coffee so weak it was essentially brown water, and bread that was often moldy by the time it was distributed. The heat below decks had been suffocating. Temperatures regularly exceeded 110 degrees in the holds, with no ventilation, except what little filtered down from the distant deck hatches. Men had slept in shifts because there were not enough bunks for everyone, and those who were not sleeping had crowded onto the deck seeking any breath of fresh air, any relief from the oppressive heat below. They had spent their days studying military manuals, maintaining equipment, exercising in the cramped spaces available, and preparing mentally for what awaited them at their destination. Sergeant Timolate Kirvan, a former sharecropper's son from South Carolina who had picked cotton from age 5 until he enlisted at age 19, had arrived at Guadalcanal in March 1943 as part of an ammunition company. The island still bore scars from months of fighting. Burned-out Japanese equipment rusted in the jungle, bomb craters pocked the landscape, destroyed aircraft lay scattered like broken toys, and the smell of death still lingered in certain areas despite months of effort to clear the battlefield. He and his unit had spent months in the grueling work of moving ordnance from ships to forward supply dumps, a task that combined brutal physical labor with constant danger from unexploded ordnance, tropical diseases, and occasional enemy activity from holdouts who refused to accept that the island had been secured. The work was backbreaking. Artillery shells weighed up to 95 pounds each, and each ship carried thousands of them stacked in holds that required men to form human chains to move the ordnance efficiently. Mortar rounds, machine gun ammunition, rifle cartridges, grenades, explosives, all had to be unloaded, sorted, inventoried, stored properly to prevent deterioration in the tropical climate, and distributed to units scattered across the island. In the tropical heat that regularly exceeded 100 degrees Fahrenheit, with humidity that made breathing feel like inhaling hot water, men collapsed daily from heat exhaustion, their bodies simply shutting down from the combination of exertion, temperature, and humidity. The medical tents were constantly full of Marines suffering from heat stroke, dehydration, malaria carried by swarms of mosquitoes that made life miserable, dengue fever, dysentery from contaminated water despite precautions, and a dozen other tropical ailments that the military medical manuals barely mentioned. But Sergeant Kirvan had noticed something during those months of labor that the white officers had missed. The ammunition companies had developed an efficiency that seemed almost impossible. They had unloaded ships faster than any other units in the theater. They had maintained supply lines through jungle terrain that confounded other logistics units. They had adapted, improvised, and overcome obstacles with a resourcefulness born from lifetimes of making do with less. The reason, Kirvan understood, was simple. These men had grown up in a nation that had never given them anything easily. They had learned as children that success required not just meeting standards, but exceeding them so thoroughly that prejudice had no room to operate. They had learned that there was no margin for error when you were already assumed to be incompetent. They had learned that survival meant being twice as good while receiving half the credit. In November 1943, the strategic situation in the Pacific had demanded more combat troops at forward positions. The invasion of Bougainville Island, part of the Solomon Islands campaign, had required every available man. For the first time, ammunition and depot companies found themselves not just supporting combat operations, but positioned on the front lines, defending the perimeter at Torquena beachhead. Corporal James Davis, a former factory worker from Detroit who had assembled automobile engines before the conflict and brought that same methodical precision to his military service, had been among the first to hear the enemy propaganda broadcasts. It had happened on his second night in the foxhole, during the tense darkness when every sound seemed amplified 100-fold, when the snap of a twig could make your heart race, and the rustle of leaves could make you grip your rifle tighter. The jungle at night was alive with sounds, insects that clicked and buzzed, birds that called in the darkness, lizards that scurried through undergrowth, and larger animals whose presence was felt more than seen. A loudspeaker had crackled to life from somewhere in the jungle, the sound initially so unexpected that many Marines had reached for their rifles, thinking it might be some new form of attack. A woman's voice had begun speaking in accented but clear English, the tones cultured and educated, suggesting someone who had lived in America or been trained by Americans. The voice had been smooth, almost soothing, with a slight British inflection that suggested education at international schools. She had started with general remarks, commenting on how far they were from home, how many thousands of miles of ocean separated them from everything familiar, how their families must worry about them every day wondering if they were safe. The voice had called to the American forces, telling them that their sacrifice was meaningless, that their leaders had abandoned them on this distant jungle island while living comfortably thousands of miles away, that their cause was already lost because the Japanese military controlled the Pacific and would soon drive all American forces back across the ocean. Then, the message had shifted, becoming more specific, more targeted, more personal in its approach. The voice had addressed the black soldiers directly, asking why they fought for a nation that treated them as second-class citizens, why they shed blood for a country that denied them basic rights that it claimed to defend around the world, why they defended a democracy they were not permitted to fully participate in, why they risked their lives for people who would not let them drink from the same water fountains, or eat at the same lunch counters, or attend the same schools, or live in the same neighborhoods. The propaganda had been sophisticated, well-researched, and surprisingly specific. The voice had mentioned recent incidents, a race-related disturbance in Detroit just months earlier where dozens had been hurt and property destroyed, discrimination in defense industries where black workers were systematically denied advancement, segregated military facilities where African American servicemen were treated as inferior, despite wearing the same uniform and taking the same oath. The broadcast had referenced specific laws, citing Jim Crow statutes from southern states, describing the systematic nature of segregation, explaining how the very government these men served had codified their inferior status into law. The voice had painted a picture of America as hypocritical, claiming to fight for freedom abroad while denying it at home, speaking of democracy while practicing apartheid, promising equality while enforcing segregation through legal and extra-legal means. Corporal Davis had listened to the entire broadcast without moving, lying flat in his foxhole with his rifle at the ready, processing every word while remaining alert for any actual threat. When the broadcast had finally ended with a promise to return the following night with more information, more truth about what they were really fighting for, the jungle had fallen silent again, except for the normal night sounds. Then he had turned to Private Luther Woodward in the adjacent foxhole, a man he had trained with at Montford Point and had known for over a year, a former mathematics teacher from Alabama who had given up a teaching position to enlist despite having dependents at home. In the darkness, he could barely see Luther's outline, just a slightly darker shadow against the black background of the jungle night, but he heard his friend's response clearly. Luther had chuckled, a low sound that held more irony than humor, more understanding than amusement, and said that the Japanese clearly did not understand what they were dealing with, had not done their research as thoroughly as they believed they had made assumptions based on surface facts while missing deeper truths that determined how men actually behaved when pushed to their limits. Luther's observation had been more profound than the enemy could have imagined. The propaganda broadcasts assumed that these men fought primarily for their country, that their loyalty to America was the source of their motivation. What the Japanese propagandists had failed to grasp was that these Marines fought for something far more personal and far more unshakable. They fought for each other, and they fought to prove wrong every person who had ever told them they were inferior. The broadcasts had continued nightly, becoming more elaborate and more targeted. Japanese intelligence had clearly done research into American racial dynamics. The messages had referenced specific incidents of discrimination, had mentioned lynchings in the American South, had cited statistics about segregation and inequality. The propaganda had been sophisticated, well-informed, and completely ineffective. Private First Class Samuel Love, a former college student from Philadelphia, had begun keeping notes on the propaganda messages, fascinated by their futility. He had recognized the Japanese strategy. It was classic psychological warfare designed to create doubt, resentment, and division. What made it fail so spectacularly was that it addressed wounds these men had already confronted and overcome. Samuel had grown up in Philadelphia, but his grandparents had been sharecroppers in Mississippi. He had heard stories since childhood about the daily humiliations of Jim Crow, about the constant threat of violence, about the systematic denial of opportunity. He had attended college only because his family had saved for years, sacrificing everything else, because education represented the one path they could not take away. When Samuel had joined the Marines, his college professors had questioned his sanity. Why fight for a nation that treated him unjustly? Why risk his life for a system that denied him equality? Samuel's answer had been straightforward then, and it remained unchanged now in this Bougainville foxhole. He fought not because America was perfect, but because he believed it could become better. He fought not for the America that existed, but for the America that could exist if enough people were willing to demand it, become what it promised to be. The Japanese propaganda had asked why he fought for a country that discriminated against him. Samuel had a ready answer, because that discrimination was a betrayal of American ideals, not their fulfillment. Because the Constitution promised equality even if reality denied it. Because his presence here carrying a rifle, wearing this uniform, was itself an act of revolution more powerful than any the enemy could imagine. By the third week at Torokina, the propaganda broadcasts had intensified. The Japanese forces, now aware they faced African-American units, had begun tailoring their messages even more specifically. They had offered safe passage to any black soldiers who would cross the lines. They had promised better treatment, had claimed that the Asian peoples understood the struggle against white supremacy, had suggested an alliance of the oppressed against their mutual oppressors. Sergeant Major Edgar Huff, now serving as a senior enlisted advisor to the beachhead commander, had been present when intelligence officers analyzed the propaganda campaign. The young lieutenant from psychological operations had seemed genuinely concerned that the messages might have some effect. He had presented a briefing suggesting that additional morale officers might be needed to counter the propaganda's impact. Edgar had listened to the entire presentation, then requested permission to speak. The battalion commander, a white officer from Virginia who had initially protested having black Marines under his command, had nodded for him to proceed. Edgar's response had been simple and devastating in its clarity. He had explained that these Marines had already heard worse from their own countrymen than anything the Japanese could broadcast. They had been told their entire lives that they were inferior, incapable, unwanted. They had faced that message not from enemy propagandists but from teachers, employers, government officials, and even fellow Americans. They had learned to function, excel, and maintain their dignity in the face of constant systematic oppression. The Japanese propaganda, Edgar had continued, suffered from a fatal assumption that these men's primary identity and loyalty was to their race rather than to their unit, to their fellow Marines, to the men beside them in the foxholes. What the enemy could not understand was that these men had already made the decision to fight long before they reached Bougainville. They had made it when they walked into recruiting stations, knowing they would face discrimination. They had made it when they endured training designed to break them. They had made it every morning they woke up at Montford Point and chose to continue rather than quit. The battalion commander had listened to Edgar's explanation, then asked a question that revealed how far his own understanding had evolved. He had asked what he could do to support the morale of these men. Edgar's answer had been characteristically direct. Let them do their jobs, judge them by their performance, and treat them as Marines rather than as black Marines. In early December 1943, the Japanese forces had launched a major counter-offensive aimed at destroying the Torokina beachhead and driving the American forces back into the ocean. Intelligence reports had suggested an attack was coming. Patrols had reported increased enemy activity. Aerial reconnaissance had spotted troop movements in the highlands, and captured documents had hinted at plans for a major assault. The attack had come at precisely 0200 hours on December 7th, timed perhaps deliberately to coincide with the anniversary of the assault on Pearl Harbor 2 years earlier, a symbolic gesture designed to remind Americans of that earlier defeat. The assault had begun with artillery bombardment, shells whistling overhead and exploding with ear-shattering crashes that shook the ground and sent shrapnel screaming through the air. The barrage had lasted 20 minutes, carefully timed and coordinated, walking methodically across the defensive positions in an attempt to destroy fighting positions and demoralize defenders before the infantry assault began. The shelling had been followed by mortar fire, smaller rounds but more accurate, targeting specific positions that had been identified through observation. Then came the infantry assault itself, waves of attackers emerging from the jungle darkness, moving with discipline and coordination that spoke to their training and determination, firing as they advanced, seeking to overwhelm the defenders through sheer momentum and numerical advantage. The ammunition companies, positioned along the perimeter, because every available man was needed to hold the line, had found themselves in direct combat for the first time, facing enemy forces determined to break through and destroy the entire American position on the island. Corporal James Davis had been manning a machine gun position when the assault had begun, the heavy weapon mounted on a tripod and positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire with adjacent positions. The training from Montford Point had taken over instantly: body position, breathing control, fire discipline, target selection, ammunition management, all executed with automatic precision born from countless hours of practice. Beside him, Private Luther Woodward had fed ammunition belts with steady hands, keeping the gun operating without pause, anticipating when the belt would run out and having the next one ready to link in smoothly without any gap in fire. The combat had been intense, but brief. The attacking forces had expected to overwhelm supply units staffed by inadequately trained soldiers. Instead, they had encountered Marines who shot with accuracy scores that exceeded infantry standards, who maintained fire discipline under pressure, who held their positions with unwavering determination. When dawn had broken at 0600 hours, the perimeter had held. The ammunition company had maintained its position without yielding an inch of ground. Casualties had been light. 3 men wounded, none critically. The unit had expended precisely the amount of ammunition authorized for such an engagement, maintaining fire discipline even under extreme stress. The Japanese intelligence officers, analyzing the failed assault from their highland positions, had faced a reality that contradicted all their assumptions. Their propaganda had not weakened these men. If anything, it seemed to have strengthened their resolve. Their combat performance had not revealed inadequate training. It had demonstrated proficiency that matched or exceeded standard infantry units. What the Japanese officers could not comprehend was the depth of preparation these men had brought to this moment. They had not trained just to meet Marine Corps standards. They had trained to exceed them so thoroughly that no one could question their competence. They had not arrived at Bougainville as reluctant soldiers. They had arrived as men with something to prove to the world and to themselves. Private Gilbert Hash Johnson had been among the men who repelled the December assault. In the aftermath, while other Marines had shown signs of stress and exhaustion, Gilbert had returned immediately to his regular duties, unloading supply ships with the same methodical efficiency he had demonstrated before the combat. A war correspondent, visiting the beachhead to cover the battle, had asked him how he remained so calm after experiencing combat for the first time. Gilbert's response had been characteristically matter-of-fact. He had explained that the combat, while intense, had been straightforward. You saw the enemy, you engaged the enemy, you prevailed, or you did not. What had been far more difficult, he had said, was walking into a whites-only restaurant in North Carolina and demanding service, knowing that refusal was certain and that violence was possible. Combat had clear rules. Segregation had been a daily battle with no rules, no victory conditions, and no end in sight. The war correspondent had included Gilbert's quote in his dispatch, and it had been picked up by newspapers across the country. The response had been predictable. Some had praised the courage and perspective. Others had criticized what they saw as social agitation, inappropriate for a man in uniform. Gilbert had read neither the praise nor the criticism. He had been too busy doing his job. By January 1944, the Japanese propaganda campaign at Bougainville had quietly ceased. The loudspeakers had continued broadcasting. But the messages no longer targeted African American units specifically. Japanese intelligence had reached an unspoken conclusion. Their propaganda was not just ineffective, it was potentially counterproductive, serving only to remind these Marines of what they were fighting against and what they were fighting for. Lieutenant Colonel Masaru Yoshida, a Japanese intelligence officer who would survive the conflict and later write about his experiences, had documented the failure of the propaganda campaign in his private journal. His entries revealed a growing recognition that the American military, despite its many flaws, possessed a strength that the Japanese command structure had fundamentally misunderstood. Yoshida had written that the Japanese military had assumed American individualism, and its racial divisions would make the United States forces brittle and prone to fragmentation under pressure. Instead, he had observed that the Americans had developed a capacity to function despite their internal contradictions, and that this very tension seemed to produce soldiers who fought with a determination that purely homogeneous forces could not match. His journal had contained a particularly revealing entry from January 19, 1944. He had written about observing an ammunition company working under enemy fire to move ordnance to a forward position. The shells had been falling close enough to pose real danger, but the work had continued without pause. The efficiency had been remarkable. Crates had been moved, stacked, and distributed with precision that suggested peacetime conditions rather than active combat. What had struck Yoshida most powerfully was something he had observed when the barrage had finally ceased. The Marines had not celebrated or shown relief. They had simply continued working, transitioning from dangerous conditions to merely difficult ones without any change in their demeanor or pace. He had written that he finally understood why the propaganda had failed. These men had already been forged in a crucible far hotter than anything military combat could provide. Back at Montford Point, thousands of miles from the combat zones, the training continued. By early 1944, over 19,000 African-American men had completed Marine Corps basic training at the segregated facility. The drill instructors, many of whom had initially viewed the assignment as punishment, had developed a grudging and then genuine respect for their recruits. Staff Sergeant Joseph Parker, a white drill instructor from Georgia, had written to his wife about the transformation in his own thinking. He had arrived at Montford Point convinced that black men lacked the discipline and courage to be Marines. After 18 months of training company after company, he had reached a different conclusion. These men, he had written, possessed something that went beyond ordinary military bearing. They had a determination that came from fighting two wars simultaneously, one against the enemy abroad and one against prejudice at home. Parker's letter had included an observation that would prove prophetic. He had written that when the history of this conflict was finally written, the Montford Point Marines would be recognized not just for their military service, but for demonstrating something fundamental about American character, that excellence could emerge from adversity, that dignity could be maintained in the face of systematic discrimination, and that patriotism did not require perfection from the nation being served. In the Pacific Theater, the Montford Point Marines had continued expanding their roles. By mid-1944, they had served on Saipan, Guam, Peleliu, and Iwo Jima. They had operated ammunition dumps under fire, had defended perimeters against assault, had unloaded supply ships under aerial attack, and had maintained logistics chains under conditions that would have broken less determined men. On Iwo Jima, Private First Class James Whitlock had been part of an ammunition company that had come ashore on D-Day +3, February 22, 1945. The beach had still been under intermittent fire, and the work of moving ordnance from landing craft to forward positions had been complicated by the volcanic sand that made every step an effort and every crate a burden. James had been moving boxes of rifle ammunition when a white Marine from an infantry unit had approached him. The Marine, clearly exhausted from days of combat, had asked where the ammunition was going. James had pointed to a forward supply point about 300 yards inland. The Marine had nodded, then said something that had stayed with James for the rest of his life. The Marine had said that he had grown up in Alabama, had never known any black people personally, and had always assumed they were inferior. He had said he was ashamed of that assumption now. He had said that watching the ammunition companies work under fire, maintaining supply lines that kept him and his buddies alive, had taught him something about who deserved respect and who did not. He had thanked James, shaken his hand, and returned to his unit. James had continued moving ammunition, but the interaction had crystallized something he had been thinking about throughout the conflict. The Japanese propaganda had been designed to divide Americans, to exploit racial tensions to break unit cohesion. What it had actually accomplished was the opposite. It had forced Americans to confront their own prejudices and, in at least some cases, to recognize that competence, courage, and dedication transcended racial categories. The statistical record of the Montford Point Marines told a story that the propaganda campaign had completely misunderstood. The ammunition and depot companies had maintained supply lines with an efficiency rate that exceeded 97%, meaning that less than 3% of supplies had been lost to enemy action, weather, or administrative error. They had unloaded more tonnage per man-hour than any comparable units in the theatre. They had sustained fewer casualties from preventable accidents than the average logistics units. But the numbers, impressive as they were, could not capture the deeper significance of what these men had achieved. They had not just performed their duties competently, they had demonstrated that excellence was not the province of any particular race, that courage could not be measured by skin color, and that the Marine Corps maxim of every Marine being a rifleman applied regardless of who had initially wanted to exclude them. By the time the conflict in the Pacific had concluded in August 1945, over 20,000 African American men had served in the Marine Corps. They had earned 48 Bronze Stars, hundreds of Purple Hearts, and the respect of the men they had served alongside. They had transformed the Marine Corps from the inside, demonstrating through performance rather than rhetoric that integration was not just morally right, but militarily necessary. The aftermath of the conflict had brought changes both swift and painfully slow. President Harry Truman had signed Executive Order 9981 in July 1948, mandating integration of all military services. The Marine Corps, which had resisted so fiercely just 6 years earlier, had integrated relatively smoothly compared to other services. The Montford Point Marines had proven that integration would not diminish combat effectiveness. If anything, it would enhance it by expanding the pool of talent from which the Corps could draw. But the broader society had changed more slowly. The Montford Point Marines had returned to a nation that still practiced segregation, still denied them basic civil rights, still treated them as second-class citizens despite their service. Many had found that wearing the uniform had earned them respect in the Pacific, but meant nothing in the American South, where Jim Crow laws remained in force. Sergeant Major Edgar Huff had returned to North Carolina and had found himself refused service at a diner near the base where he had trained. He had been wearing his dress uniform, his ribbons displayed, his rank insignia clearly visible. The refusal had been polite but absolute. Edgar had left without incident, but the irony had not been lost on him. He had fought for his country, had proven his worth beyond question, and yet he still could not eat at a public restaurant. Yet Edgar and thousands like him had not become bitter or defeated. They had recognized that their service had been part of a longer struggle. That changing hearts and minds required not just battlefield courage, but the patience to continue fighting when the battles took different forms. They had laid groundwork, had demonstrated capabilities, had shattered assumptions that had seemed unshakable. In 1987, 4 decades after Bougainville, a group of historians had begun documenting the history of the Montford Point Marines. They had interviewed hundreds of veterans, collected documents, and assembled a record that had been largely overlooked in standard military histories. The project had revealed stories of courage, competence, and quiet dignity that deserved wider recognition. One interview had been particularly illuminating. Corporal James Davis, now 73 years old and retired from a career as a factory supervisor, had been asked about the Japanese propaganda broadcasts. He had smiled at the question, his eyes distant as he recalled those nights on Bougainville so many years before. James had explained that the propaganda had fundamentally misunderstood who they were and why they served. The broadcasts had assumed they fought primarily for America, and that revealing America's flaws would shatter their resolve. But they had always known about America's flaws. They had lived them every single day. They had not fought because America was perfect. They had fought because they were Americans, because this flawed nation was still theirs, because making it better required being part of it rather than separating from it. He had described how the propaganda had asked why they defended a democracy that excluded them. His answer then and now had been the same, because their presence in the military, their performance in combat, their undeniable competence made it harder for America to maintain the fiction that they were inferior. Every supply ship they unloaded, every defensive position they held, every commendation they earned was an argument more powerful than any speech or protest could ever be. The Japanese propagandists had thought they were exploiting a weakness in the American military. What they had actually encountered was a source of strength they could not comprehend. Men who had already overcome obstacles far greater than enemy action, who had already proven themselves against critics far more relentless than any foreign enemy, who had already won battles against a system that had tried to exclude them from the very beginning. In 2012, 6 decades and 7 years after the last Montford Point Marine had completed training at the segregated facility, Congress had awarded the Congressional Gold Medal collectively to the Montford Point Marines. The ceremony in Washington had been attended by over 400 veterans, men now in their 80s and 90s, who had gathered to receive recognition that had been too long delayed. Private First Class Samuel Love, now 93 years old and one of the oldest surviving Montford Point Marines, had been present at the ceremony. He had listened to the speeches, had accepted the medal, and had been asked by a young reporter what the recognition meant to him after all these years. Samuel's response had been characteristically thoughtful. He had said that the medal was meaningful, that recognition always mattered, but that the real victory had been won 70 years earlier on islands most Americans had never heard of. The victory had been proving that they belonged, that they were capable, that the Marine Corps and the nation were stronger, for including them rather than excluding them. He had added something that the reporter had found surprising. He had said that in a strange way, he was grateful for the Japanese propaganda broadcasts. They had forced everyone, the enemy, their fellow Marines, and perhaps most importantly themselves, to confront fundamental questions about loyalty, service, and what it meant to be American. The propaganda had failed because it had underestimated the complexity of human motivation, had reduced men to simple categories, had assumed that grievances would override all other considerations. The truth, Samuel had explained, was far more nuanced. Yes, they had been angry about segregation. Yes, they had resented the discrimination. Yes, they had recognized the hypocrisy of fighting for freedom abroad while being denied it at home. But they had also loved their country, had bonded with their fellow Marines, had taken pride in their service, and had believed that their presence in uniform was itself a revolutionary act that would help transform the nation they served. The story of the Montford Point Marines and the Japanese propaganda campaign had ultimately revealed something profound about human nature and about America itself. The propaganda had failed, not because these men were naive about their country's flaws, but because they understood those flaws more deeply than the propagandists ever could. They had failed because loyalty and service spring from complex sources that cannot be reduced to simple calculations of advantage and disadvantage. The Japanese intelligence officers who had crafted those broadcasts had operated from a worldview that emphasized hierarchy, homogeneity, and unquestioning obedience. They had not understood that the American system, for all its flaws and contradictions, had produced men who could think critically about their nation while still choosing to serve it, who could acknowledge injustice while still believing in the possibility of change, who could maintain dignity and purpose even when denied the recognition they deserved. By the time Lieutenant Colonel Yoshida had written his final journal entry about the Montford Point Marines in April 1945, he had reached a conclusion that troubled him deeply. He had written that the Japanese Empire had been defeated not just by superior American industrial capacity or military technology, but by a social resilience that his own nation's rigid system could not match. The ability of Americans to incorporate criticism, adapt to internal challenges, and draw strength from diversity rather than seeing it as weakness had proven to be a decisive strategic advantage. Yoshida's journal had included a prescient observation about the post-conflict world. He had predicted that America's greatest strength in the coming decades would be its capacity to evolve, to extend its promises more fully to all its citizens, and to grow stronger through the very process of confronting its own shortcomings. The Montford Point Marines, he had written, represented not an anomaly but a preview of what America could become when it lived up to its stated ideals. The final chapter of the Montford Point story had continued long after the conflict ended. The men who had trained at that segregated facility had returned to civilian life and had contributed to their communities with the same excellence they had demonstrated in uniform. They had become teachers, business owners, civil rights activists, and leaders in countless fields. They had raised families and had passed on to their children and grandchildren the lessons they had learned. That excellence was the best response to prejudice, that dignity could not be taken away, but only surrendered, and that change required patience, persistence, and unwavering commitment to doing what was right. The Montford Point facility itself had been decommissioned in 1949, integrated into the larger Camp Lejeune complex as military segregation had ended. But in 2007, a movement had begun to preserve the site's history. The Montford Point Marine Association, established by veterans in 1965, had worked with military historians and civil rights organizations to ensure that the story would not be forgotten. In August 2007, the Marine Corps had renamed a building at Camp Lejeune in honor of Sergeant Major Gilbert Hash Johnson, recognizing his service and his role in Marine Corps history. The ceremony had been attended by over 200 Montford Point Marines, and the Commandant of the Marine Corps had delivered remarks acknowledging that the Corps had been wrong to resist integration and that it was stronger for having corrected that mistake. The Japanese propaganda broadcasts, those sophisticated psychological warfare efforts that had seemed so promising to enemy intelligence officers in 1943, had become a historical footnote, a failed experiment that had revealed more about the propagandists' blind spots than about any weakness in their intended targets. The recordings of those broadcasts, preserved in military archives, served as evidence of how completely the Japanese command had misunderstood the men they faced. What the propaganda had failed to account for was the fundamental reality that these Marines had already been fighting their entire lives. They had fought against a system that had tried to limit their opportunities, constrain their ambitions, and convince them of their own inferiority. They had developed resilience not through military training, but through daily survival in a society that had never given them anything easily. They had learned to maintain hope and dignity in circumstances far more demoralizing than anything the enemy could create. The loudspeakers in the Bougainville jungle had broadcast messages designed to break their will. But those messages had been whispers compared to the chorus of discrimination, prejudice, and systematic oppression they had faced since birth. The enemy had offered them safety if they would abandon their posts, but they had never been safe in their own country, and yet they had persevered. The propaganda had questioned their loyalty to a nation that treated them unjustly. But they had already answered that question by the simple act of enlisting, training, deploying, and serving with distinction. In the end, the story of the Montford Point Marines and the failed Japanese propaganda campaign had illustrated a truth that would resonate far beyond World War II. It had shown that human beings are far more complex than simple categories allow, that loyalty and service spring from sources deeper than material calculation, and that the men most tempted to give up on their country are often the ones who hold most firmly to its promise. The young men who had trained at Montford Point had not been naive about American society. They had understood its flaws with a clarity that came from direct experience. But they had also understood something that the Japanese propagandists had missed, that nations, like people, are defined not by their current failures, but by their capacity to grow, change, and become better versions of themselves. Every ammunition crate those Marines had moved, every supply line they had maintained, every defensive position they had held, had been both military service and social revolution. They had proven their competence so thoroughly that it became impossible to maintain the fiction of their inferiority. They had demonstrated that excellence knew no racial boundaries. They had shown that the Marine Corps, and by extension America itself, was stronger for including them rather than excluding them. The propaganda broadcasts had ceased on Bougainville in January 1944, but their failure had echoed through the decades that followed. The Japanese intelligence officers had learned that psychological warfare requires understanding your enemy, and they had fundamentally misunderstood the men they faced. The Montford Point Marines had not needed enemy propaganda to know about American injustice. They had lived it. They had not needed anyone to tell them they were fighting for a flawed nation. They had always known. What the propaganda could never shake was their conviction that being American meant fighting to make America better, and that their service was itself part of that fight. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.